Hi, my name is Vanessa Zaboriak, and I teach food law and policy in the JD program and to sustainability students, as well as administrative law, which covers a lot of FDA law and USDA law. I guess I've always loved food. I've always loved food and I've always loved animals. Growing up, I went to a small school that was on a farm. And so tending to the livestock was part of our school day. And growing vegetables for consumption was part of our extracurriculars. So it's just always sort of been there. And my mother loved gardening, even though she kills everything. So she instilled in me a love of gardening, for productive uses. And I also kill everything, but I try because, it's just instilled in me, you're supposed to try.
Yeah.
You're supposed to try again and again, no matter how many times, you kill all the things. So I still try to raise my vegetables. I haven't had anything come to fruition this year, but I have 2 small children, so that's life. I do have a new flock of chickens, and 75% of them have managed to survive the first 6 months, so I'm going to count that as a win. So it's just sort of been a part of my life, and I never really thought of it becoming part of my work until I became an attorney. And looking around at all of the people trying to do interesting things here in Winston-Salem with food, I realized that there's a need for people to be able to liaise between creative small enterprise around food and also just people wanting to homestead and homestead without running afoul of the law. They need someone to be able to liaise between them and the city, state regulations, making sure they're not being a nuisance to their neighbors, and also being put in touch with programs that might actually make it easier for them to get started. One of the reasons I loved Winston and why I moved here is because we actually have one of the friendliest regulatory environments for startups, for growing your own food. This is a great place to be for them. So, and it was just perfect timing. A lot of people doing stuff they love here, a lot of people with great ideas, perfect climate for it. And then as a professor, I realized that there was a gap in the curriculum. Everybody's talking about food, except we weren't talking about food at the law school. And so I designed my food course to emphasize not just the federal level administrative agency aspect, but also coming all the way down to the ground and looking at how municipal ordinances shape the kind of food culture we can have, how our poverty programs shape the kind of food we can access. So it's a pretty broad approach that looks at all the things, all the levels of government and all the aspects of our food choices. That's a really long answer. Okay, so some of the most pressing issues in food policy, I would say, are food access in low-income communities, a frustratingly paradoxical problem of food waste, the incredible amount of food produced that gets wasted, and then lastly, unsustainable ideals for the American diet. Basically what it comes down to is we need to take the food that's being wasted, give it to the people who need it, and we all need to accept that we should eat less meat. That is what's going to be best for our environment. That's going to be what's best for sustainable food for people, and for the greatest number of people. So there's a lot of different aspects of this, some of which just involve a change in people's way of thinking, and some of which we can aid with positive policies and positive new regulations and laws. As far as access goes, we need to be working at removing regulatory impediments to getting food to where people are. Most of this is at the local level. We're pretty good at it here in Winston. We're still working on making sure it's easy to get mobile produce into low-income neighborhoods. But cities can take a look at their ordinances and see, are there ordinances on the books that make it hard for people to take fresh food into poor neighborhoods and sell it on site? Are there policies that make it difficult for farmers markets to operate pop-up markets in low-income areas? Have we crafted our mobile food unit ordinances, like for food trucks, in a way that is suited primarily to the gourmet food truck experience eater, or have we done it broadly enough that it can also be about service? We need to make sure that in a foodie culture we're not forgetting that that's just the icing on the cake of this change, and primarily this needs to be about remembering transportation limitations, food desert issues, and bringing food to the people. And then secondly, like what's happened in France with the grocery store waste, where they just passed a law making it unlawful for grocery stores to adulterate the food that is going out of date that they're throwing away. Basically, it's making dumpster diving safer. Now, obviously, what would be better than that is a sustainable program of moving that day-old bread, moving that end-of-shelf life produce to another location where it can be safely handled and given to people in need. The amount of food waste, especially in the United States, we generate is staggering. It's approximately 40% of produce grown is thrown away without being consumed. That's crazy. We just need to make it a priority. And part of what we need to do to make that happen is we need to take a look, and this food safety is really important. I'm not saying we should weaken our food safety laws, but I think we need to look very realistically and see if some of our food safety laws that are making it hard for us to take donated produce and donated food that's at its expiration date and ensure that it goes to use, we need to ask whether that really reflects the best science. And especially when you're talking not about is something able to be put on a truck and transported across the country, but can I pick it up, walk it across the street, and serve it at a shelter? So we need to be looking at ways to minimize waste in the first place and then responsibly reallocate it. And then lastly, and here's where I'm a bit of a zealot, we need to eat less meat. As a country, we need to stop expecting that a healthy diet requires daily meat, because right now that's not just creating an environmental hazard. The number of gallons of water it takes to produce 1 pound of beef, it's staggering. Estimates range, but a very low estimate is 275 gallons of water. And this in a time of abnormally dry and drought conditions. The percentage of grains and cereals being grown as forage for beef cattle is astronomical. And this is not the best stewardship of our land. This is definitely not best stewardship of our water, because a typical 40,000 head hog farm, and by the way, I spend a lot of my job talking about poop. A typical 40,000 head hog farm produces the same amount of waste as a city of 250,000. That's everybody inside the city limits of Winston-Salem. And most of that is under-regulated, and that's how you end up with fish kills, and there's just a lot of problems. The other reason it's a problem is because it creates negative health impacts on the poor. If we expect to have meat in our diet, and a diet without meat is considered deficient, then our food poverty programs are going to reflect that assumption. So we're feeding cheap, crummy meat to school children because it's part of the school lunch program, because we can't imagine not feeding them meat. And since our budget is so small, we're feeding them the worst meat. And we're also, that meat is costing more than what we're paying to feed it to the children. We're just externalizing those costs. The costs of the environment, the cost of worker health, all of those things. So we're making it so that people expect to have meat, and they end up then eating very unhealthy meat, and they end up eating meat that has been produced irresponsibly with less concern for animal welfare. I mean, the children are not eating grass-fed, free-range, antibiotic-free, loved livestock. And we're also, the same assumption about meat being part of the diet that's showing up through school lunch program is also showing up in all of our other nutrition assistance policies. Our food for the elderly, Meals on Wheels. We could do more with less if we stopped insisting on the centerpiece meat. Not to mention, in my opinion, we have a moral obligation to think about our relationship to livestock. We need to think very critically about whether we're comfortable with what's happening here. And obviously you can't regulate vegetarianism. You can, however, stop putting roadblocks in the way of the people at the federal level who are saying the exact same stuff I'm saying right now. A division of the USDA developed updates to the dietary guidelines recommendations that the USDA puts forth that emphasized a plant-based diet. And immediately, Congress, in preparing the budget for the agency, told them that none of their money was allowed to be used to implement the dietary guidelines or advertise the plant-based aspect of the guidelines. They deliberately impeded a move toward a plant-based diet. When the USDA suggested that other federal agencies, in order to create a more healthy workplace, implement a meatless Monday, the Beef Council went crazy, and the USDA had to apologize for suggesting that we voluntarily have meatless Mondays in our own office places. So that's not something that we can regulate, but we can stop getting in the way. That was really long. So it's always a little tricky to say our values because we do not, in fact, have a shared national set of values. So I want to be very careful about whose values I'm espousing. But I'm going to start from a place where we believe, at least all of us here together right this second, believe that it is our duty to take care of the least among us, that we are uncomfortable standing by and letting children live in food insecurity, that we do not believe it is appropriate for multi-generational farms to get forced out of operation. And let's just assume that we all agree that we would like our children to have access to drinking water and a landscape that has not been entirely plundered. Whether you believe in market solutions or legal solutions, let's just proceed from, and I could be wrong, but we'll proceed from the idea that these things are things we can all agree on here. So, in the environmental context, our current legal framework does not look multiple generations ahead when we're talking about agriculture, it's not that we don't have, laws about the environment. We have a Clean Water Act, we have a Clean Air Act, we have regulations to attempt to attain our targets for emissions and so forth. Agriculture is basically exempted from every federal environmental statute and from every federal labor statute. That's a different problem I'll talk about in a minute, proceeding from the assumption that none of us like slavery. On the environmental problem, we don't have federal statutes preventing agricultural industry from polluting. We do require, once they're polluting enough and into the right kind of water, that they will have to get a discharge permit. And then on the state level, we've carved out all sorts of exemptions for agricultural pollution. Look what's happening in Surrey County right now with chicken farms. There are no state rules requiring industrial chicken farms to buffer themselves from their neighbors. If you're zoned agriculture, you can put these barracks full of chickens, and every waste product they create on that land, you can convert from tobacco to industrial chicken farming, and you don't need a permit. Your neighbors don't get to be heard. There's no rules about buffers between you and them, and the state has actually preempted municipal ordinances to add requirements to make it more tolerable for neighbors and make it safer for the environment. And when you get a concentration of these things, it's immensely toxic, and you cannot come back from that kind of ammonia concentration in the land for generations. So right now, in that regard, our legal framework is completely at odds with the notion that we should be taking care of the land and that we should be rewarding good stewardship of the land. There are some programs in place that are administered through local soil and water conservation districts to help offset the cost of implementing better management practices, but that's a drop in the bucket, and it's not enough to make it valuable for large industrial farms. Smithfield doesn't care about your conservation grant. Then as far as the labor goes, if you don't like slavery, our current policies aren't very good because agricultural workers are, first of all, exempted from wage and hour statutes. They are exempted from the Fair Labor Standards Act in regard to union rights. There are farm workers' unions, but the protections are extremely limited. As far as their housing goes, we have very minimal requirements for farm worker housing, and the cost of housing can be deducted from your pay. And also the immigration category that we use for immigrant farm labor is one that ties the worker to the employer. So if you're unhappy in your employment, you cannot vote with your feet and go pick strawberries for somebody else. You're stuck with your employer, or you have to leave. And so that gives employers incredible control, even if they're not doing any of the other things that are difficult to police, like holding on to people's papers, etc. Workers are at an incredible disadvantage, even in a time when low-wage American workers broadly are at a disadvantage against management. This is pretty extreme. So if you don't like slavery, our legal framework isn't reflecting your values. As far as food access goes and the idea that we don't like children to suffer and live in hunger, our legal framework does a much better job reflecting those values. Our challenges there are challenges of execution, not laws. We have nutrition assistance programs. Accessing SNAP benefits is not hard. Maintaining, the requirements you have to jump through annually are minimal compared to other assistance programs. The financial cutoff point, while it could be more generous, far more people are eligible for SNAP benefits than other assistance programs. And that benefits everyone in the household. We have WIC assistance where the income cutoff is even higher. We recognize that we don't want children to go hungry. The problem is in the execution when we either, like with WIC lists, there are certain foods that are eligible for WIC, and how well states are adapting their lists to the actual cultural needs of WIC recipients really varies. Huge fight over corn tortillas. Because, well, it doesn't matter. The point is, there are issues with making sure that culturally desirable foods are purchasable with WIC, and not imposing onerous and bizarre restrictions on which size box of cereal you can get, and ensuring that you can use your WIC benefits to get more fruits and vegetables. Because right now, you can get, I want to say it's $10 a month in produce with your WIC benefits. That's unhealthy and gross. On the other hand, you can't use your WIC benefits to buy meat, so there's that. Well, not much. I think you can get canned chicken and canned tuna. SNAP benefits you can use for anything, so that's not as problematic. School lunch program has done wonders to curb child hunger. It's great in theory. We just need to come up with ways to ensure that what's getting on children's plates is fresh. Partner with local agriculture to strengthen that connection between children and their food, because you can make sure they don't go hungry all you want, but if you're not teaching them to love their food, to feel good about their food, then you're putting a Band-Aid on the problem. So we need to stop incentivizing schools to contract out with companies that pre-make frozen meals that store forever, and we need to start bringing back kitchens. An awful lot of schools now don't have on-site kitchens. They're just reheating things. If we can move away from that and move towards a model that emphasizes fresh preparation, that's gonna handle nutrition and sort of a life skills training and a healthier approach to food. But as far as the fundamental value that we don't like children going hungry, our legal framework reflects that value. It just gets there a silly way at times. But it's doing the best it can with the money it's got. I think those were the main values that I identified as agreeing to. Okay, what can religious leaders think about or do to help change our policies to match our values, or to help implement better practices? So, the church garden is great. The church garden is actually an amazing place to start, especially if once the produce is there, you're using that as a point of connection with communities you want to serve. It's great if everyone's aggregating it and taking it to crisis control ministry. That's great. It's also great if you familiarize yourself with the rules about whether you can load this into your car and take it to a neighborhood yourself for distribution. Make that community connection part of your food connection. You're breaking bread at a shared table as opposed to dropping off the bread on someone's table and then, eating dinner separately. And I think that there are times when, depending how garden projects run, it ends up either being largely the effort of one or two people, or it becomes a Sunday school rotation exercise where different children are in the garden at different stages, which means that you're not actually developing broadly in your church community these skills to make your food. Developing those skills allows you to teach other people those skills. It's great to drop off a whole bunch of extra zucchini with people who don't have a lot of zucchini, but what if you showed them? If you make yourself aware of the rules on what is available, what you can have in public housing as far as plants go. Great, bring someone zucchini, but what if you bring them a hanging basket of squash plants instead? What if you develop expertise that you can share with communities that have vacant land that they want to grow on? Learn your ordinances and learn what you can propose and partner with community. Additionally, this is going to sound really silly, but it's not just the growing. It's value-added foods as well. Learn how to can. Get people in your church to pass those skills along so that as far as strengthening that connection between these ideals and how your congregation personally eats, make them feel connected to the process. Have this become a lifestyle for your congregation, and then give them the tools to pass that on to others. I would also say become really aware of brands, farms, where you're putting your money. Talk about whether you're putting your money where your values are. Especially when people are frugal. I know a lot of churches have couponing groups, to help teach each other how to, super coupon. That's great, except that most coupons are for brands that are creating processed crap, really. I don't know if I can say crap in divinity school, but I can say it in the law school, so I'm saying it here. Teach by example that these chemical foods are not nutrition for the soul, that we need to shift away from that, even if it's a better bargain, that there are corporations that have practices that are destructive to the environment and to human dignity, and share that. As a congregation, have an open communication about what that means. And think, too, about whether some of your ministries are creating an additional disconnect where fresh food and food you've canned at home and artisanal cheese is good enough for your family, but then you're having food drives that are full of heavily salted canned beans and off-brand fake Kraft mac and cheese, the orange kind. Think about whether what you're saying is poor people will be happy to get low-quality food. Now that's all small and that's close to home, but the other thing you can do is make yourself aware of when agency rulemakings are happening on the federal level. When agencies make rules, they have to have a public comment period. As a congregation, have a group of people whose responsibility it is to monitor comment periods relating to rulemakings that have the ability to impact more closely aligning that legal framework with our values, and comment. Set up an email chain so that you're reminding other people in your congregation, hey, we've got 5 more days to comment on, this tweak to the school lunch program. Because that actually works. If you've ever wondered if it worked, watch the John Oliver segment on net neutrality and know that after 15 minutes of introducing people to the comment period function, the regulations.gov website crashed, and it was the most comments that have ever been received, and the agency completely changed course on net neutrality. They're responsive, and they have to be. So have someone whose job it is to know what's going on the federal level.